Let's come back. And what we are continuing to talk about, to chant about, is a new poetic of delivery for the new scalars of civilization that are opening so fast, but also leaving a trail of wreckage for all that had become entrenched and dug its heels in, and not only will not change now, but didn't change back then, and so forth. So that while the dynamic of time, when it becomes complex in civilization, and not just a single dimension of time, but 4 more dimensions of time come into play: vision, art, history, and science as dimensions. And each one more powerful would be the rhetorical word, but more creative is the artistic word. Real is the scientific word. We began with Laniakea, the first image computer generated of where our home is. A super duper cluster of galaxies, several hundreds of thousands, over 500 million light years, and that it is not only huge, but it has a twin, it has a pair, it has a symmetry. About the same size and shape, the Perseus Pisces super duper cluster of galaxies, so that together that pair are about 1 billion light years. And it is so devastating to see that they're just a tiny corner of the structure of the universe with hundreds of billions of galaxies, tens of millions of superclusters of galaxies. Just now, the lack of preparation is classic, which is why the future and the new past as a symmetry are one of the prime campfire places for a new time form to bring together those who are beginning to hear, beginning to read, beginning to write, to, in this night of a new time form, to pass that night by telling the entrancing stories and tales of not only what really got us here and really where we are, but really what is possible, because the dawn will surely come. In alchemy, it's called aurora. In Homer, the day always begins when the red light, the reddening of the light on the horizon, begins to signal that today is the day of activity. Homeric man was not a little circle with appendages like sticks and a little head, but was a mannequin with mobile, flexible parts, and was capable of being dynamic, of being in the time, on time, not just in nature, but in the civilization. we got as far as understanding that the feminine wisdom, insight, very often is a clue to trace and be able to follow, because it is almost perennially ignored. Given second place, given third place, given no place, almost never given paired place. And it's that tuning fork of paired place is one of the characteristics of our new aeon. And with that tuning fork, we are able to make a set of tuning forks which are able to tune a new instrument, like a piano, which has 11 octaves, and to be able to tune it with a set of tuning forks brings it into the ability to play the music of a Mozart or a Beethoven, which could not be played adequately on harmonic chords, harpsichords, etc. And it is that ability to bring the piano into the quality where one has, at the stretch of the prelude to our new aeon, the kind of chamber combo like a Bill Evans, a Miles Davis, a John Coltrane, making an album called Kind of Blue, which is the largest selling music album in the world to date. It is this quality where the chant poetic of an orality put into a sonorous song poetic is able to bring us the feeling-toned images and the language that cascades itself by the creative exploration expressionally of art and through a historical building of a critical understanding of possibilities to the science of the real. That what we're reading, what we're writing, what is being said is real. One of the characteristics of the early 20th century is the surreal peculiarity of joy and sorrow occurring paired together. New dimensions to the word poignant. These volumes are from the Bollingen series on the archaeology of Samothrace. Volume 7 and Volume 10 in two parts, text and plates, text and plates. These volumes are on Arsinoe's Rotunda. These volumes are on her husband Ptolemy II's propylaeon. A propylaeon, of course, being like the goalpost of a long pilgrimage through the world to come to this island, Samothrace, to this place, the temple in Greek. It's a mega theroi logoi, the great God's place of worship. And through Ptolemy II's propylaeon, a very large structure where the sacred path coming from the coast of Samothrace a couple of miles up into the temple complex and crossing a sinuous way and approaching the rotunda of Arsinoe II, the first view of her great drum-shaped building, commemorating the way in which the circling of the chorus of the worshippers, the logoi, the theoi, those who are contemplatively alert, who are conscious in their understanding of life and love and the real, are able to make this end of this great pilgrimage, not a pilgrimage just in the world, but a pilgrimage of civilization to come to this revelation, this portal of access to the participation in the revelation. And one finds this entire development made effective in the 270s BC, reinstituted in the Hajj to Mecca by Islam, the great Hajj that is required of you once during your life, and to go to Mecca to circumambulate the Kaaba for men. There is a lot of joy in finding out, but there is a nostalgia for updating by understanding the entire entourage of civilization. One finds, as we've been showing again and again, that there is very often a feminine consciousness, not only in a differential conscious art, person, creative ability, but having mastered enough of the history dimension. History is a phase and a dimension. A phase of fermentative transform from the natural cycle, and a distillation of that transform into a second transform of a kaleidoscopic consciousness, where the form of understanding and expression is science, scientia. One doesn't just know, or know metaphorically as a gnosis, but one is able to understand the real in terms of its sealed opening into an unsealed presentation, unwrapping the present. A little bit after the previous carrier wave, new aeon, which was technically about 9 BC. Not only the consecration of the great temple that Augustus Caesar built to commemorate his power of establishing the Principate, the Roman Empire, but his understanding, because he had a whole coterie of very intelligent people, always, like Virgil and Homer and Marcus Agrippa and so forth, the crème de la crème. He understood that one must pay due respect to the feminine. And so in 9 BC, after 4 years of construction, the Ara Pacis Augusti, the temple of the peace of Augustus, dedicated to his wife Livia, his young, new wife, his second wife, Unfortunately, Livia curdled under the sourness of great power, world power, and the rest is a terrible story. But in the Ara Pacis Augustae, and it was rediscovered and found at the conclusion of World War II in Rome, on what was the Via Flaminia. The Via Appia, the Appian Way, goes south, and the Flamens is the priests in Roman religion. The way of the priest goes north, and where the way of the priest brings from the farther reaches of Italy, North Italy, and beyond into Rome, a much more expansive, powerful thing than the Appian Way. The Via Flaminia, where it entered the city limits of Rome, of Augustan Rome, right there on the banks of the Tiber, where the Via Flaminia came in to the city, is where the Ara Pacis Augusta was made. And when one goes into the reconstruction of it, one follows the great frieze that is Augustus and his family and all the powerful people of Rome lining up to come into the entrance. And there in the entrance is an altar where it's like a shape within a shape, and one can go into the Holy of Holies, the altar, and there on the back wall of it is the frieze of the whole import of it all. Tellus Mater, Mother Nature, holding the new life, holding the nurturing of the real, dedicated to his wife, Livia. If one comes out of the Ara Pacis Augustae and turns into about 100-degree about face and looks across the Tiber, you see the great structure of the Castel Angelo, the great fortress, and just beyond it, and taller than it, the Dome of St. Peter's, the Vatican. Is a straight line to power in the Roman imperial mode. Still there. It's almost impossible to realize that when we look at Laniakea, the new supercluster of galaxies, the way in which our understanding of home has expanded beyond surreal, so that even a book on Tibetan Buddhism now called Spaciousness has a beautiful heliograph of our sun against a starry expanse of the galaxies. Spaciousness, the radical Dzogchen of the Vajra heart. Dzogchen is Tibetan Zen. Vajra is jewel, diamond. The diamond-hearted wisdom. Longchen Pa, one of the great Tibetan Dharma masters, his 3-volume classic was translated by Herbert Gunther, Kindly Bent to Ease Us, Longchen Pa's wisdom. It takes an immense learning to be able to marshal together what has happened and what is happening and what could happen, not what will happen, because it is what is being visioned and artfully expressed and prismed into jewels, a jewel matrix, that the actual history dimension churns from that, and the scientia, the science, becomes honed not to see the real, but to be real. The illusion for the egocentric mind is that if it can see the probabilities out of the possibilities and get the most probable, that will be the way forward. That is an illusion, and to believe it is a delusion. Comes under the heading of best laid plans of mice and men. Again and again, one finds an incredible realization. Gunther, who was a tremendous figure in the way in which Tibetan Buddhism was finally understood in a real way. His greatest book, The Life and Teachings of Naropa, published by Oxford, and the year is 1963. I bought this copy in San Francisco, 1963, Paul Elder Books. But nowhere in the life of Naropa, nowhere in the songs of Naropa, nowhere do you find a mention that Naropa wrote a manual of baptism. About 1,000 years after John the Baptist. And how it gets to be there is one of the great stories of civilization. The Maharaja of Gaikwad, in his Oriental series, had this published in Baroda, which is north of Bombay towards Ahmedabad. And its title is in Sanskrit, Sekodesha Tika. Sekodesha is the quiet faith that what you're doing is real. And it's not why we're doing it, it is that we are doing it. Tika is a sub kind of commentary. It's a small commentary, and it's by Naropa. And Mario Corelli, D-Lit, published this in Baroda in the midst of World War II in 1941, when the Japanese were invading Pearl Harbor. The Vajrayana baptism manual was being published in a little kingdom in India, almost forgotten. It's never been reprinted. How does it come to pass that someone has a copy who knows what to do with it and what it is? Gunther went from a European distinguished career and found refuge in Canada, Western Canada, in Saskatchewan, of all provinces, in Saskatoon, which is mid-Saskatchewan, which means it's very far north. It's about 400 miles north of the U.S. border. I was at the same time in Calgary, which is only about 200 miles north of the U.S. border, in the early 1970s, 45 years ago, and met Gunther one cold evening in Calgary in the midst of winter. That evening was about 35 below zero. As I've said before, driving to the University of Calgary to attend his lecture, the puffs of exhaust from the cars just hung in the air like little white puffy clouds, which cars going through would scatter a little bit, and the headlights would diffract from the ice particles in these clouds and make rainbows everywhere, billions of rainbows, trillions of rainbows everywhere. And so the great speaker on the matrix, jewel matrix of the cosmos in the Diamond Way, had an evening of presentation in a kaleidoscopic rainbow rainstorm in Canada almost 50 years ago. To make the real by plan is illusion. To believe that it can be done is delusion. The therapy, the therapist involved in that is learning. And the very first thing that is presented is learning how to learn. Not learning how to learn by plans, but by doing it. The planned learning, the system of education, the engineering system of education came in the 1960s, when computers were first coming into play, and they were still on punch cards, arranged mechanically, and computer places were full of fine dust from the cards and bits of this and that. I remember working for a month at Wells Fargo New Computer Place in early 1964 in San Francisco, and it was a junkyard. It was apparent. You cannot plan for what undercuts it by whole dimensions and what overtone makes it scintillatingly possible, much less by the respect for the mystery of the real. So we live in a cutting knife edge, a scimitar sweep of a regression back, and it's the regressions in time forms that become knots. And one thing about knots is that knots have all different kinds. And there are knots that don't tie to cinch the knot. There are knots that keep getting knottier. And so one gets finally a kind of a squiggle cacophony. If you look at electron micrographs of molecules, you will find that they don't come together in Tinker Toy. You can tell my age. Little ways. They have all kinds of squiggles, spirals, because that's the way in which that dynamic of the complexity of life has its progress. It doesn't go in very powerful lines at all. It goes in complexes of squiggles. And when you tamper with a part of a helical structure that, despite all of the Miro-esque squiggles, is real and understandable in many dimensions, especially 11 dimensions, the squiggles no longer are able to have any kind of chirality that makes any kind of a sense. And they begin to skew, and they become scrambled. And it is the scrambled squiggles of tampered genomic life that cancel out. They better, stronger. They neuter out life from reality. Not nothing nothing can be very fertile. Neuter is like a gear that's shifted into neuter. You can't go forward or backward, but there are neuters that do not allow you to turn the key at all. You can't turn it off. In Homer, it's called a limbo. Not only is there no time, there's no space, there's no reality. It has the hypnotic attractor quality of real death, of real evil. And so there is always a response to that on time, and always has been there, not only for carrier waves and reference waves, but there are powerful subunits like midpoints. In between a reference wave and its carrier wave is a midpoint. The reference wave to the carrier wave about 350 years and the midpoint about 175 years. Our reference wave is 1650. Our carrier wave, say, 2000. Actually, it was 1991. Midpoint, 1825. What's going on in 1825? Jefferson finally finished his University of Virginia, a completely new university. He did the architecture, he did the curriculum, he provided the library, he laid out the grounds, he brought in the professors, he brought in the students. It was the first time since Plato's Academy that one had a complete ecology of education. At the very same time, across the Thames from the power structure in London of the British Empire revving up, we're going to have redcoats where the sun never sets on our power. And with his longtime helper wife, Catherine, William Blake was doing the illustrations to the book of Job, and working at the same time on a very large project of the illustrations to Dante's Divine Comedy, and many other things happening at the same time. Midpoint, where a reference wave begins to not just be in its generation of its genius, preparing for that carrier wave, but has achieved traction towards realizing it, towards having an illustrated complexity like the book of Job, where one can, in an artistic production of presentation, begin to understand the visionary through the art, making the historical dimensions understandable for the first time, so that in symbol, vision, art, history, square of attention becomes actually a morphing where it begins to be a diamond of insight, which is always a pair, because it can be chirally one rotation or the other. It can be clockwise or counterclockwise. And to understand the pairedness of the diamonds of insight as dimensions of consciousness, one can see the world for real for the first time in a complementarity. That the square of attention of nature and the diamond of insight of consciousness, when they're brought together, that's called a mandala in Sanskrit. It's an 8-starred corner. From page 3 on in the notes for this week, It is about the development of quantum complementarity, not quantum mechanics. That's a planned misnomer. Next week we'll go deeper into it and bring out some of the qualities of the feminine wisdom, which is bubbling to the creative, not just the surface, but breaking the surface tension and becoming that kind of perfume that characterized the early Mahayana as the atmosphere where one really has freedom. If he knows the five skandhas as like an illusion, but makes not illusion one thing and the skandhas another, if, freed from the notion of multiple things, he courses in peace, then that is his practice of wisdom, the highest perfection. Those with good teachers as well as deep insight cannot be frightened on hearing the mother's deep tenets, but those with bad teachers who can be misled by others are ruined thereby, as an unbaked pot when in contact with moisture. It will fracture and be useless. More next week.